Well, good morning. Welcome to today's webinar. Just a word of thanks, first of all, to our sponsors. We're very lucky at the FS Club to have a range of sponsors who enable us to run our program of activities, and in particular these webinar series. So I'm Mike Wardle. You may have seen me before. I'm the Chief Executive here at CEN. And my responsibility this morning is to chair the event. Look, I think we've gone on to the last slide rather than the program slide. We'll just have to flick back through the slides. So I say my job is very much to introduce the session on culture, art and heritage in the built environment. We're very pleased to have with us Eric Reynolds, who'll say, I think, a bit more about himself when he comes to speak, but is founding director of Urban Space Management. As I say, I'm Mike Wardle. My job is to chair today, and the programme today is very simple. After my very brief introduction, we'll have a presentation from Eric of around 20 minutes, and we've got about 20 minutes for Q&A. If you haven't used GoToWebinar before, the way to put in a comment or a question or an observation is to find the question tab on your dashboard on screen and to type in your question. When we get to the Q&A session, I'll moderate those and we'll have that discussion with Eric. The session is being recorded today, so if you missed anything and want to go and listen back, or if you have colleagues and friends who you think might be interested, the session will be posted up on the website within a day or so, and that'll be available for people to go back and re-watch. Finally, just say if you do put in a question or comment today, we will share your email address with Eric, so if there's any need for any follow-up discussion, that can be made easier. And I think that's all by way of our housekeeping today. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce Eric Reynolds with a long and distinguished career in urban space management and founding director of that organisation. Eric, really looking forward to the presentation. Over to you.
Good morning. Culture, art, heritage, built environment. Maybe we'll go to the next slide straight away. Good. It's clear to all of us, but not maybe front of mind, that we do live our lives, those of us anyway who are in towns, we play out our existence on a stage formed by more or less hard surfaces. And unless we are a very large developer ourselves, we actually live our lives in other people's hard surfaces. I called my organisation Urban Space Management when we started in 1972, because for one reason or another, I thought the space between buildings was sort of important, and in fact more important to most people than the interior of a building, because the bit they experience is the outside. I say to you today, a building is more than an umbrella to protect us from the weather, and a pavement is not just a way of keeping our feet free of mud. Buildings and pavements have the power to depress or to cheer, and just now we all need to be rather cheered, so it would be good if we understood that if we make things well, it enhances life. If we make things badly, it does the reverse. The eagle eye will notice, eagle eye amongst you, of course, will notice the form there in the middle of Michael Gove, who at the moment is that person who's supposed to be protecting us. He's there talking to members of the design team for Poundbury 2. A lot of people think Poundbury is a bit twee, but at least Poundbury is thought right through. The details matter. Next slide, please. In contrast, and this is why my point is balance is so important, in contrast to this empty space, there are pavements, but it ignores the fact that the street is a common experience and ignores balance. It's replaced the opportunity for diversity and interest and so on with mono use. And I'm sad to tell you that it's entirely empty. Next slide, please. Next slide. There we go. Mono development, no mix, no people. This really is the way it looks. and it's built on public land. It's a disgrace. No mix, no people, 520,000 square feet of emptiness. Lots of material used, lots of carbon expended, lots of concrete, but no habitation, no use, no excitement, no interest. Terrible. Next slide. It happens even where there is some life. In this case, it's a brand new office tower, and the developers justified the height by setting back the ground floor as a piece of public realm. But having created that public realm, it is so lacking in atmosphere that only months after opening, a food market was installed under a sign that claims, you can just about see it in the slide, "We are alive." How sad that a building, brand new, expensive, has to stand there and improve its own view of itself by saying, "We are alive." The empty and so-called public space do not add, in my view, to the sum of human happiness. I doubt even the architect will be happy that his clear and clean and beautiful ground space has been covered with frying fat. Next slide, please. Now, contrast is evident in this next slide. And my case here is that we should preserve the good and reject all that is not. This example of Victorian pub frontage is rich in detail and material, including etched glass, glazed tiles, and so on. A really handsome, small development. Whereas the modern shopfront across the road, this is in Soho, by the way, is flat and boring and lazy and will need much more maintenance. The Victorians made their pub front there almost self-maintaining. The rain washes off and it doesn't require, as on the other side, new glazing on a regular basis. Next slide, please. Sorry about the text, but I just think the point is we should protect and encourage education, imagination, and skill in the making and care of all physical things. They matter not just to the person who owns and builds them, but to everyone. If we do exercise the right level of control and interest and care, it enhances not only the life of those involved in the process of making, but all those during its life seeing and touching and in this enhanced world. Our forebears, now obviously we do a lot of things better now than we used to do, but our forebears had quality, including visual quality, embedded in their hands and hearts. Take a glance at any 18th century door. The skilled joiner simply couldn't make an ugly object. Their skill, learnt over a period of apprenticeship, made good-looking objects, and their training made it possible to make these objects in a speedy way. The grand houses that were knocked up on the great estates were produced really fast. A bricklayer, certainly in the Victorian area, a bricklayer would lay over 1,000 bricks a day. Now we're quite lucky if they produce 200. Therefore, we must educate, train for, and insist on the highest quality in design and making of all new structures and spaces. Of course, against that is cost. It's a major innovation to obtain quality and speed of delivery. We now think that speed and delivery and low cost are the gods. I suggest that they should be balanced. Next slide. This is a fine example. This is the Braithwaite viaduct. Railway lines run over it. The railway lines, when they started to spread across London, needed to be elevated so that pre-existing roads could run underneath them. These fine brick arches were built by an engineer with a simple task to support his railway track. The modern engineering equivalent is, sadly, often just a practical but coarse lump of concrete. Wherever possible, we should preserve what's good and find sustainable new uses. Next slide. In this case, this viaduct created, as I say, by an engineer, not by an architect, but an engineer, had been left empty for over 50 years. We took it, this is at Bishopsgate, we took 10.5 acres of space there, and with very small sums of money, because it was a finite, quite short lease, we transformed that arch into a community swimming pool. We supplied it with heat and power through a combined heat and power, which made it possible for us to have local schools swim for £5 a session. So 20, 25 young people could come and swim in Braithwaite's marvellous set of brickwork. Next slide. Unfortunately, a large part of it was demolished. And my point here is that rubble doesn't make an uplifting sight. Such devastation dampens the mood of all who pass it by. And that is true. For us to see things crushed is not helpful, unless, of course, you're a contractor who operates brick crushing machinery. But we don't want too many of those, certainly not in our crowded cities. Next slide. So again, the point is balance. We're about to have difficulty in Liverpool Street Station, where we have a sack of gold for the few versus public good for all of us. And that is not equality. The sack of gold will not recover for the rest of us a sensible public good. Next slide. The bag of gold, of course, is so-called air rights. Just in those words, air rights, you can see that means that someone's going to suffer, someone is going to have a reduced access to air and, in this case, light. Next slide. When the marvellous, actually, Bishopsgate developments were created by really caring and creative developers, Liverpool Street Station was extended, but extended in what you could describe as a pastiche, but it was extended in a caring way with the original train shed respected and the sense of space and light and joy, in a way, of moving through that space on your way to and from your train. Particularly if the train's been cancelled or delayed, it's nice to be in a space which is joyful rather than not. It's now proposed to build over the concourse. So where you see light and air there will be a concrete deck, and a 10-storey office block will be created above it. And the Great Eastern Hotel, Grade 2, listed, starred, will have a large new building hovered over it. So the hotel will still exist, and the developers will have told us, that we're not losing anything, but of course we are, because we're losing all its context. Over it will be a large concrete structure. Developer argues that there will be a new public benefit, and in this case, when questioned, it really boils down to 2 escalators and a lift. Now, surely we can do better than 2 escalators and a lift in exchange for a large concrete structure. Travellers that pass through probably won't see the balance as being in their favour. Next slide. Continuing the station development theme, this is an example at the Angel, where a design of an over-station building was carefully negotiated. It was quite a fight, but carefully negotiated to complement the surroundings. Sadly, this building is being demolished after less than 30 years. Now, we all know now that we should be worrying about carbon and waste. Next slide. There it is on the way down. Developer again argues that it's really not so bad because they're going to leave the core in place. Next slide. This is what we're swapping. We're swapping a nuanced building which is just 30 years old. For a glass block, obviously there will be more lettable space in the glass block because the glass block is square and fills the entire site. But what it doesn't do is in any way help us with the carbon argument, which we're now also aware of. And neither does it add any sense of diversity. And diversity is something that humans like. They like a sense of diversity in building form, diversity in materials, diversity in what they experience when they're on the pavement. Next slide. Now, obviously not all buildings, new buildings, are bad. These are quite good. But you'll notice that they've been grouped really greedily squeezed together. And there are dark canyons. I took this photograph on my telephone in daylight, but imagine how dark that space is in the evening and at night. And there are people who are forced either to put very good curtains over their windows or to avert their eyes when they look across at the building on the other side, where all sorts of activities may be going on that you might not want to be public. Next slide, please. Another station related. The public realm is often claimed as the benefit that flows from development. In this case, the right-hand side of the image shows a part of a wind and rain swept new public space, which is balancing apparently the loss of the marvellous Edwardian, full of rich detail post office building. And all we seem to get in exchange is a couple of escalators that crash into, again, greed has driven this particular. I don't blame the architect. I think the architect was simply doing what the client required, which was to maximize floor space in the new building. So the access from the station is really uncomfortable. That escalator literally crashes into the remaining brickwork of the original station. Next slide. One might ask if the crashing of Liverpool Street Station, and of course many other examples exist, is really required. Do we need all this space now? My little slide here with up for sale. That's 3 buildings at Canary Wharf, which are currently up for sale. I recently sat at a lunch next to the young man whose job it is to find alternative uses. And I mentioned that one of the big uses in London and other major cities at the moment is storage, because so often now we're building quite small apartments and there's no room for their books or their winter clothing or any exciting bits and pieces that enrich their lives in their apartment. So they all go off and pay £60 a foot to store in Big Yellow Box or one of those competitors. And it may be that these and other mono-use large office buildings are not terribly easy to turn into residential or any other smaller scale activity. And so perhaps storage, although I said it tongue in cheek, perhaps storage for the moment until we invent another use of these buildings might be what we have to do. So the risks of unbalanced large-scale development is clear in my mind. And so I think there's a case for more timely, less capital intensive and more human scale alongside, not instead of, but alongside. Next slide, please. As a quick example is this tiny yellow building with a circle around it, is the only public building that was open to the public during the construction phase of the hugely successful 2012 Olympics. We built that as a way in which the people who'd been disenfranchised, kicked out, sent away, their buildings closed, to create the large spaces, could come back and could see, should they wish to, maybe cry, but come back and understand what's going on. We built that little building for 300,000. I can't tell you how much money that stadium then cost to reconfigure as a soccer place. Next slide. So, property industry, obviously, like everything else, has cyclical ups and downs. Mega schemes have mega risk and nearly always take too long to get through the system and to get constructed. They often don't really succeed because time moves on. Things that were originally decided as the fashionable use of that space for the moment no longer are. The Canary Wharf is an example of that. And the risk really to the rest of us is that during a period of development, we're all waiting. Next slide, please. So, you can all read this in your own time, but some projects never actually work. Large projects which are built don't work in the end. Not all, of course, a lot of them are fine. But I think it's worth us considering, alongside the large mega blocks, the much more interesting, in a way, lightweight, energy efficient, human scale. Next slide, please. Here's an example. The top of this image on the slide is the remains of a huge basement that had been excavated. I sold the whole to people who were demolishing other buildings and needed to be able to reduce the amount of lorries moving stuff about. And the deal was that they would make me a shape that made a swimming pool. I'm not fixated on swimming pools, but they seem to be quite a good way of using a hole. And it was great. Even the Financial Times, who are normally rather hard-nosed, liked it. Next slide. Another simple example, Sainsbury's, very good organisation, wanted to build a superstore, absolutely fine, but they wanted to demolish what had been Liberty Mills and turn it into a car park. A few people in the community decided this was not a good idea, and on the right-hand side is what we achieved for about 1.6 million. A good number of jobs and a good, exciting place to go to, and a cleaned up river. Next slide. Another one, some of you will have been to Camden Lock. On the left-hand side is the way we found it in 1972. It was to be demolished and would have been demolished if we didn't have a very speedy deal with the Waterways Board. It was to be demolished for a cloverleaf for the Westway. And of course, in the way sometimes you will remember, sometimes government run out of money before they actually build whatever it is they set off with. Some of you will have been to Euston and seen the big hole in the ground there. And instead of which, lightweight, human scale, Camden Lock, recently resold for over £1 billion. Next slide. Last slide, you'd be glad to know. Left-hand one, absolutely the last piece of land within the LDDC, London Docklands Development Corporation. They were persuaded to hang on to it and make it a different place, a place for creative people, rather than another big block with a tiny arts centre at the bottom. And the right-hand slide shows what we did. You can still see the shape of our little 3.5 acres, all human scale, with 700 people working there. So, message is really care about space between buildings and consider at the time when plans are being created the idea of lower scale, get it done quickly. That's it.
Well, thank you so much, Eric, for that run over. some of the concepts and ideas that you've been working with. Got a few questions in. First of all, Hugh Purser, just wonders whether you can expand on the question of new build versus renovation or refurbishment, and especially the cost side. Is there a difference in the equation between public use buildings and private residence, for example? Maybe just a few words on that.
Well, as always, it depends who's doing it and how they're doing it. Clear to me anyway, is that we should respect what exists. That doesn't mean we always keep it. It doesn't mean we always protect it. But we should respect it and look carefully before we do. Earls Court is a large-scale example of this, a perfectly good large exhibition space. It was very popular. Demolished and left empty for years and years. 3 or 4 times I have been asked whether we could go in and do some interim stuff. And the answer is, if they'd left the buildings up, yes, they're huge economic value. Cost, of course, of bringing maybe that exhibition space up to modern standards, unknown, because it wasn't considered at the time. It should have been considered at the time. Sometimes spent looking at the alternative. Can we make an existing building suitable for modern activity? If the answer is yes, then the spreadsheet should be carefully examined.
Thank you for that. Simone Kyriakou has asked, he's intrigued to hear what you think of the kind of recent news investigation into the quality of UK new housing. So not enough, more expensive, smaller floor space than their European counterparts. What's the answer when it comes to affordable housing alongside other redevelopment, do you think?
Well, we had a perfectly good standard in place, which was invented and refined in that space of time when a lot of local authority housing was quite good. In the space of time soon after the Second World War, good quality housing with the Parker Morris standard. Now it's rather terrifying. If one goes to look at a modern development, look carefully at the size of the furniture. I think you might find that a lot of it has been shrunk. It's quite fascinating, actually. I'm quite fat, and for me to get through some of the doors that the volume developers at least put into houses, I can't imagine doing it with my shopping in my hands, for example, because they've squeezed it as hard as possible.
And do you think that's simply the greed factor? Is that what's going on?
Well, I get into trouble for using words like crap and greed, but there is no doubt at all that space is a liberating commodity. Too tight and everything feels more like a cage, I think, for anybody. And for us to have abandoned Parker Morris standard, which included cupboard space. Again, go to any of the lifestyle photographs that you'll see in colour magazines where volume house builders are trying to sell their space. It's always 3 young people, so that they cover the sexes and colours. And they always have a glass of wine in their hand, and they're always on the balcony, because that's the only way to make this thing actually tick the space box. Why do you imagine all those? They look almost like shelves jutting out from apartment blocks. That's there to satisfy the planning requirement for a certain amount of amenity space to balance the number of units inside. And it's particularly harsh on affordable, I think.
Thank you. Shane Dragon has the commercial real estate area and just notes the current downturn in the commercial real estate market. How do you think that'll affect the built environment in big cities like London or New York? And we can talk about China, where the real estate market is really depressed. And if there is going to be a change, how long will it take for those changes to kind of be felt?
Well, time is a really important factor. It's why I think we should carefully avoid early demolition. there are too many now. I mean, it's considered easier to knock things down, so you apparently have a start, and you don't need planning to knock something down, so you get it done. It might make the funders feel better that there's actually some action on site, but there are many, if you simply hover over London, considering the amount of demand there is. There are many empty spaces which have been created. Actually, a point I didn't really make is that one of our major culprits is, of course, TfL and Railtrack. They create empty space and then search for development partners. There's a site just behind me, the limo site, which has been empty since 1960. And we're on our third or fourth attempt at getting a development partner for TfL, who say they don't have enough money to do it for themselves. So they will be tempted to go the greed squeeze route, except just at the moment, as we all know, there's a bit of a slowdown. So it could be that I'll be dead before that site sees a single spade in it.
Thank you for that. Just you mentioned some of the use of office towers. You mentioned storage as one option.
Yes.
Are there other options or other uses that might you might be applied to these office towers, if we put our imaginative hats on?
I think exactly what you've just said. We need to put our imaginative hats on and not necessarily imagine it's a one-shot thing. We're all familiar, of course, in Mayfair with houses that have been built speculatively as houses, then became offices, then became sort of small banks, and then now are being converted back into really expensive and marvellous living. Very difficult to do with the sort of offices that I can see out of my window, Citibank, Barclays, HSBC, massive banks of very high speed lifts, very expensive things to keep going. Difficult to imagine certainly low cost housing being able to afford the service charge required to maintain. So I think we do have to be creative. And in fact, the AJ is launching tomorrow a competition for ideas for the Marks and Spencer's building in Oxford Street. Mm-hmm. Because it's an opportunity. Here we are, cities by their nature morph all the time. There are a few fixed things, often railways fix things, and cathedrals fix things. But apart from that, then it's up for imaginational grabs.
One of the ideas I know that Mike Manelli, the Lord Mayor, is taking forward is the idea of conversion of office space into laboratory space, because our universities are short of lab space, and I think that's a fine example of being imaginative about what might happen to these spaces.
Absolutely. He'll know, of course. There's a ventilation question. You need to be able to properly ventilate and all the rest of that sort of stuff. But now is the time for us to recognise that one size fits all no longer is a good idea. It might work for socks or something, but it doesn't work for buildings.
Sure. Clive Bullens asked whether you have any recommendations of the best places to go for a walk and see historic and interesting sites in London. I mean, I'd say most parts of London, but are there particular highlights that you'd pick out?
I think you're spot on to say most bits. During the much blamed COVID, I have lived in my house, which has been it was built as a house, then became a Conservative Association club, and it's now a house again. I walked on streets that I must have passed through in one way or another over 30 years in which I've lived in that house, and found new things. So I think you're spot on. London is an exciting and interesting place almost everywhere.
I always think that in London, if you just raise your eyes a bit, there's so much fascinating detail in the brickwork in most of London that it's worth just having a wander around.
It certainly is, except unfortunately for the simple, slightly lazy use of glass as the only material for the skin, because then all you're really going to see is a reflection of yourself.
Yeah. You hadn't really mentioned churches and other use kind of buildings. And are there sort of general places and plans for the maintenance and reuse of churches and other similar religious buildings? Is that another stream of work, I guess?
I think it's really interesting and sad in equal measures, really. Church of England, of course, there are other faces as well, but the Church of England is rapidly deconsecrating and emptying their built estate. And they argue, perfectly correctly, that they have much more of it than they ever need, well, now need. Victorians rushed around and built an awful lot of quite big churches. They're not bad. Some of them are really quite exciting and interesting to look at. Brickwork's good. But even the well-organized dioceses seem not to have a pattern book for how they should be considering how these buildings will be used, rather than do what they appear to be doing, which is just let them go in both senses, let them fall down and let them go in the sense of giving the responsibility to someone else. I think there's an argument for the Church of England, if it could, to, in the same way as it looks carefully at questions about same-sex marriage and so on, it should look carefully at its estate and maybe, I've used the words pattern book, maybe think about a passport to the future for these buildings. And isn't as simple as turning them into mosques. There is a demand for that, but they're often in a key place within a community. And it may be Church of England, although it's a fairly rich organisation, can't itself afford to look after them all forever. But what it isn't apparently doing is, for example, finding themselves a panel of smaller developers, not certainly in residential, not the major volume developers who've rather a fixed pattern that they roll out. But smaller building firms and so on, to see physically what can be done. How can we stop the lead being stripped off the roofs so that it turns the buildings into a wreck in no time? And maybe put it together with the education department and think about them being a form of educational building, perhaps Saturday club, all sorts of things. It's time for large users, large estate owners, such as the church, to come up with at least the beginnings of a way forward.
Thank you for that. I just wondered what about international comparison, I guess. I mean, are there things you think we can learn from other places? London can learn from other places about how to do it as well. And are there things that we should be exporting in terms of our ideas and our thoughts about use of space?
I'm sure, as your question suggests, that it should be a two-way street. I think it's awfully sad that a lot of larger developments ape New York. The number of New York delis that have appeared everywhere, they don't work for every place, but they're sort of photocopied onto a map rather than thought through. So we should learn not to ape other places. But there are plenty of places in Europe, I think particularly of Holland, where they have been working much more energetically to deal with climate change and have really good capture. For example, interseasonal. Today is a fairly warm day. I'm sure if you were to walk outside your building and put your hand on the pavement, it would be warm. we're not capturing that heat. We could. Next time you see whoever it is, whether it's the gas provision or water provision, when they're digging up the road, there should be a simple solution there of putting black plastic pipe in there, not to carry anything other than heat collection. So we can learn from people who've been doing it for longer and have been through the pain of learning how to do it, instead of us thinking that we have to invent everything. We can certainly export and do export our architectural expertise. The major UK firms are working hard all around the world, as are engineers also. Of course, they can only be as good as their client. So we need to push the client button a bit harder.
Thank you. Michael Dury's said your comment about the Victorian bricklayers and today's bricklayer he found very interesting. Do we know why we've fallen behind and how we might catch up again?
Well, I mean, some of it's good, the health and safety thing. I can't start in the morning on a construction site of ours without having a toolbox talk where we get everyone together and we tell them what's going to happen that day. It all sounds very good. And that rule has been created, and unfortunately the rules accrete, so we get more and more and more of them, without carrying skills alongside it. So almost every time the Victorian bricklayer was properly trained, he had been apprenticed, he did know how to do it. His hod carrier was someone who was relatively fit and strong and prepared to climb a ladder with a hod of bricks on the back. And you can see there's marvellous pictures, these gentlemen with watch chains and waistcoats, banging it out, really, really laying bricks to high quality, square and flat, nicely detailed. Unfortunately, if you go now to any of them, when there are less of them, brick constructed properly, structural brick rather than just a skin, most of the people are subcontractors to subcontractors to subcontractors, and there's no continuity of skill, training, or expectation. We throw an awful lot of things out the window.
I think the old construction industry systems were good training, but I know that bricklayers, when they are starting as apprentices, have a much slower bricklaying rate than they do 5 or 6 years into their career. It's something you get build up to over. I think that consistency is really important.
Yeah. Practice makes perfect.
Well, thank you very much. I'm afraid we've run out of time, but that was a fascinating overview. I hope you, the audience, enjoyed it. Once again, thanks to our sponsors. We are really, really grateful for their support in keeping this set of webinars going. Just moving forwards into the upcoming program. Next Thursday, on Thursday, we have a session on It's Not What You Know You Are, it's who you know you are, what's it take to be a female engineer. Revving up how the digitisation of trade and trade finance is accelerating next week. And then on Monday, the 8th of April, Intelligent Money, Our Future is Where We Do Not Think About Money, as our money thinks for us. So interesting things coming up. And in response to recommendations about walks to go on in the city, we do run occasionally in the City of London walking tours of historic buildings and historic pubs and other things. So keep an eye on the website for those as well. Just remains for me to thank you for your attention and your, being with us today, and big thank you to Eric for his presentation and thoughts this morning. Thank you all very much.